is author of Breakneck, China's Quest to Engineer the Future. And he's a fellow of the Hoover Institution, and he's also one of the most cited experts on China's technological capabilities. Dan, you've written that America and China are, quote, fundamentally alike, restless, eager for shortcuts, ultimately driving most of the world's big changes. Who's winning in that race?
There is no winner, but I would say that there are two losers, namely the U.S. As well as China, perhaps only superseded by one bigger loser, namely Europe. So I think that there are three major geopolitical blocs in the world. All of them have had this amazing capacity for self-harm that gets demonstrated again and again. Now, I speak from the perspective of a Canadian, perhaps the biggest loser of all. But I think that from my perspective, China has messed up a lot of its own economy out of a choice by top leader Xi Jinping to mostly demolish a lot of the property sector, as well as smack around a lot of tech company founders like Jack Ma. President Donald Trump is doing what Donald Trump is doing, and namely eroding a lot of alliances with partners, harming the manufacturing sector through tariffs, and imposing all sorts of harms on the U.S. as well. And we don't even need to drag the Europeans into this, but look at what they're doing to their own energy supply, as well as the fundamental lack of growth on the continent. So three big losers on the table.
Any winners in the world that you can look at? I know Britain isn't one, and I don't think that Japan is particularly, certainly not Russia either. I mean, it must be pretty unusual in world history to have endless losers and no winners whatsoever.
Well, here's where I apologize for being glib. I don't want to suggest Kyrgyzstan is winning, but it seems to be a very beautiful place. First of all, I want to acknowledge that for the most part, growth is positive for most of the world. For people in China, the U.S., and Europe, and many other parts of the rich world, people are, for the most part, living without fear. They are getting on with their lives. Markets are going up. But I think there is a substantial case to be made that, at least with these big powers, they have engaged in a lot more self-harm than is necessary. And a lot of what I want to do is for the humiliating self-beatings to cease so that morale can improve.
Mentioned tariffs. Obviously, we've had this Supreme Court judgment that seemed to underline what a lot of people thought anyway, which was that the founding fathers thought that tariffs were the role of Congress rather than the executive. Is that going to change everything or anything or nothing?
Hopefully some things. As President Trump has asserted these new tariff powers, and our colleague Philip Zelikow has written a piece to say, well, the tariffs are illegal under these new tariff authorities as well. But I think that it is a fairly messy process. I think that it is really good that the Supreme Court push back very forcefully to say that the president may have the power to impose a blockade, but that doesn't mean that he has a power to create further taxes without congressional approval. And I think that the main issue with the tariffs is not exactly which legal authority that they are based on. I think that there may be a way to impose the tariffs smartly at a good level. And we have not seen that happen under Trump, in which it is a scattershot, in which some firms, especially those connected with the Republican Party, may be able to have greater exemptions. He raises them, he lowers them. It destroys a business's capacity to plan. And what we have seen is that over essentially the past year, after the tariffs, the U.S. has lost around 80,000 manufacturing jobs. So at a first approximation, the U.S. is not reindustrializing.
So the very point, the very underlying drive behind these tariffs is just simply not happening. In fact, the opposite is happening.
That is the evidence so far. It might switch. The Trump administration is always saying that something will switch soon. But so far, we've lost nearly 100,000 manufacturing jobs.
You've written in the past about the positive aspects of Donald Trump and specifically his dynamism. Tell us more about that.
I think that Donald Trump is able to ask good questions. Now, I suspect that he generally offers the wrong answers to useful questions, but I think that he was someone who opened the discussion in a much wider way among elites in Washington, D.C. Well, should the U.S. do something about China? Now, I think that a lot of his proposed solutions against China, namely tariffs, namely export controls in his earlier administration, namely prosecutions of Chinese scientists or scientists of China's heritage, most of these, I think, have backfired on the U.S. and have not accomplished very good goals. And he has erratically switched to being, I would say, probably the most pro-China panda hugger in the White House today. And it is very, very strange, some of these statements that he would make about Xi Jinping, in which he has said, I quote nearly verbatim, when he said to the Wall Street Journal that Xi is brilliant, nearly perfect. And, everything about him just comes out of Hollywood. And, this is like he's describing Tom Cruise or something. But, it's just very, very odd, the sorts of compliments that roll out off of Donald Trump's tongue.
He seems to have much the same kind of bromance thing with Putin going on as well. Is it just that he likes strong men, slightly wishes he was one himself, admires the fact that they can dominate their countries in a way that he hasn't quite been able to himself?
Well, they can also throw in Orban, and I don't know what exactly it is. He has also praised Xi Jinping's great head of hair. You can't say that about Putin. You can't say that about you or me, Andrew. So maybe there's
so true. So true.
There it is.
Back in 1960, it was that there was a missile gap between the Russians and the Americans. Is there an engineering gap today between the Chinese and the Americans?
I think that my understanding of the missile gap was that it was overstated at the start and rapidly proved fairly wrong. But it was a little bit of a limited understanding to certain folks in the national security, defense, intelligence establishment that actually what the truth was. Now, when it comes to the U.S. and China today, I would say that the truth is much more evident that many of us can see that Chinese manufacturing is overrunning the world, including the U.S., in many ways. We can see that with something like electric vehicles, in which I think that the Chinese are making much better electric vehicles with higher capabilities than American EVs at much lower price points, all at the same time. The Chinese built around 300 gigawatts of solar power. In China last year, the U.S. built about 30 gigawatts. China has about 40 nuclear power plants under construction. The U.S. has 0, and continental Europe has like -3. So, we have all of these pretty stark disparities that all of us are able to see, in which my expectation is that China is going to be, by default, going to be the world's most sophisticated manufacturer in a few years from now, maybe a decade from now. There are some exceptions in which the Chinese are not making pretty critical technologies that include semiconductors and aviation, where they have not cut up to the leading edge. But where it comes to pretty much anything else, any other manufactured good you care to name, my expectation is that within 10 years, they are going to reach German, Japanese, American levels of quality at Chinese prices.
And they're going to, you mentioned nuclear, obviously not having great oil reserves, they're going to need energy, vast amounts of energy. They don't want to continue to buy it from Iran and Russia, and they possibly might not be able to buy it from Venezuela for that much longer. How long do you think it'll be before China is self-sufficient in terms of energy?
Self-sufficiency, at least with respect to oil, is a very tall order. So China remains the world's largest oil importer. Now, what they have done is that they have blunted the growth of oil. And so I think that there is a quite keen sense that China has already reached peak oil and they're on the path to decline. And that, how have they achieved that? Well, mostly by electrifying the economy as much as possible. So what uses a lot of gasoline? Well, gasoline-powered vehicles. And what has China done? Well, about 1 in 2 cars sold in China last year were electric vehicles, and some of the best electric vehicles on the market. So China has figured out EVs. It's figured out especially the critical battery supply chain. It has built enormous amounts of power, not just nuclear and solar, as I mentioned, but also vast fleets of coal plants. And so, in a sense, China is not very clean when it is powering its vehicles. But what it has done is that it has been able to power its vehicles with domestic nuclear, domestic coal, domestic solar, and it has done that by electrifying the economy. So China right now is, I believe, the second most electrified major economy right after Japan. And pretty soon, in a couple of years, it will be the most electrified economy because it has built so much capacity, so much of the transmission lines to move the power across the country, and also figured out the use cases so that people actually desire to use these big products. And so that's a very keen sense in which they are investing in the future to solve a national security need. And this is where I wish that there was a more urgent sense from the West, the US, continental Europe, the UK, really to try to engage in a lot of this thinking, to invest in a lot of the same sorts of projects to solve its own deficiencies.
You mentioned EV and national security. There was a debate in the House of Lords only yesterday about how Chinese electric vehicles are not going to be allowed onto British military stations because they're considered essentially to be sort of, I don't know, spy mobiles for China. Is that paranoid, or is there something genuinely behind that?
Well, I think that the UK wouldn't be alone in having this fear. And we can take a look at only a few years ago when the Biden administration, not the Trump administration, but the Biden administration reached the same determination and essentially has banned a lot of Chinese EVs from coming into the country through this connected vehicle rule. So, the Americans have a pretty high ban against Chinese EVs, which is partly why we can see Chinese EVs in Mexico, a lot of parts of Europe, and we cannot see them almost at all in the US. Now, I think that I would say that first, this is a fairly paranoid move. It may be legitimate, but it is also quite paranoid at the same time, because if we take a look at what the Chinese are doing, the Chinese have allowed a lot of Tesla's electric vehicles to be produced in Shanghai as well as driven around in China. And, my sense is that Beijing is not lax about national security, but they have somehow made the determination that Tesla's EVs could be driven around. And I'm wondering, why, the Chinese are somehow less paranoid in this case than the West. What do you think?
Well, I don't think that Elon Musk is using all of his cars as attempts to spy on China in the way that perhaps the Chinese EVs could be used to spy on us. That's the, I suppose, the obvious answer.
Well, I think that it is really hard for Beijing to put their fears to bed that whether Elon Musk or someone else in the US and the US government could not compel some of this data to be transmitted to Washington, D.C. or London or wherever else. And so I think it is difficult for them to fully trust that such things could be possible. It doesn't have to be driven by Elon.
With regard to engineering, how does a country like America, which isn't centralized and where you can choose your own college major, how does it close a engineering gap like the one that you're talking about, where only a matter of years the situation is going to be very much worse for the United States?
I think that has to be a recognition of America's own strengths as an engineering state from the past. So the U.S. has been no slouch in terms of building incredible projects. There's this term called the American Technological Sublime that refers to projects that include Manhattan Project, the Apollo missions, Hoover Dam, Golden Gate Bridge. All of these are highly inspiring, incredible feats of engineering, to say nothing of the transcontinental railway, the federal highways, the skyscrapers in Chicago and Manhattan. The U.S. has certainly built. The U.K. has certainly built when it founded the Industrial Revolution with all of these little steam engine contraptions in Scotland and wherever else in Northern England. And so I think that the West has certainly had these heritages of engineering, and a lot of that came to a halt in the U.S. By roughly the year 1970, when the U.S. had this very stark turn against the engineering state, driven by books like The Power Broker about Robert Moses building too much in New York City, Silent Spring, too many chemicals being sprayed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Jane Jacobs. There was a cultural moment, there was a legal movement to really restrain the engineers. And I think now is a moment to ask, given pretty severe housing shortages across the US and the UK, rusted manufacturing base, the inability to complete almost any infrastructure, whether or not we should recover some of that heritage. And I think that there should also be a glance over the Pacific, not across the pond at Europe, but across the Pacific at what the Chinese are building, to seriously ask. The Chinese are adding so much power capacity. They have excellent ports and railways. Their manufacturing base is not rusted. If we take geopolitical competition seriously, if we take seriously this idea that the Chinese are making not only a lot of rare earth magnets, but also active pharmaceutical ingredients like fermented antibiotics, like cardiovascular drugs. What happens if the Chinese deny cardiovascular drugs to the elderly across the world? Should we not do something about that? Should we not do something about not waiting the future of technology, namely things like electrifying the economy, artificial intelligence, anything else? I think what we have nothing to lose from acknowledging that the Chinese are ahead in many ways. The Chinese have been very good students of the West, including Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Europe, the US, and they have really tried to catch up in a very big way. And I think that it is now time for the US to really try to look at China to be in a sense of catch-up mode.
I think you hinted at it earlier. Hasn't American notorious litigiousness held America back? Not just America, Britain also, with our statutory instruments and our endless legal requirements with regard to building and so on. You've called it, and it's a word I'd never seen before, a vetocracy, as in a veto. The power of the lawyers to veto things. We've obviously had the most appalling business with HS2, the rail link in Britain, which has cost hundreds of billions and nothing's happened. Heathrow Airport now is going to cost 30 billion pounds to build. So that's what the chief executive has said about the third runway there. And a lot of this is down to lawyers. What can be done about that? I mean, China does not have this problem for obvious reasons.
Well, first I should acknowledge that I picked up the term vetocracy from our colleague Francis Fukuyama, who has pointed out that the U.S. is extremely complex by a lot of different standards, too many jurisdictions. The Bay Area, speaking to you from Stanford now, I've learned has 26 different transit agencies to serve a not especially large population. And so, there is some weird complexity with the U.S. and indeed with across the Anglosphere, where it's not just the Americans who have not built enough. The Kiwis, the Canadians, the Irish have also not built enough homes as well as infrastructure. And so my view is that at a first approximation, when it comes to urban planning, don't trust anyone who speaks English. I think that they have just the Anglosphere with a system of common law in which just convince a judge to block a development. That has actually been, I think, far worse than, let's say, the French way of building, in which this is much more bureaucratically managed. And my description of the U.S. is as a lawyerly society where all the presidents went to law school. Every single presidential nominee from the Democrats between 1980 to 2024 went to law school. And I think that there is a way in which Donald Trump is a highly litigious person and therefore a product of the lawyerly society himself. Now, the UK, as I understand, is a little bit different. Sir Keir Starmer may have been a lawyer, and perhaps a lawyer's lawyer, but actually there has not been that many lawyers inside the House of Commons, as I understand. The UK is a place I describe as the PPE society, which it's pretty remarkable how many prime ministers studied politics, philosophy, and economics at Balliol College at Oxford University. Now, I think you get a pass, Andrew, because you went to Cambridge. But
thank you. And also, we don't have PPE as a subject. It's not a Cambridge. You can't get a Cambridge degree in PPE. But that is kind of you to mention. You're quite right. It is an extraordinary thing. The power of that. Lawyers and PPE together, they're going to strangle a country.
Yes, well, two great things even better together in this sort of toxic mixture. And I do find it incredible how the FT has just reported that home building in London has completely collapsed. It's like housing starts are nearing zero. It seems to me like London has housing prices that are close to California levels, while the country as a whole has income levels closer to the state of Mississippi. So how does this work? HS2 is, extremely expensive. Third runway at Heathrow has been going on forever. And, I've also recently learned about the Leeds tramway project, in which I believe the Council of Leeds legislated to have a tram project starting in the 1990s to build a tram. And last I checked, the first phase will not be completed until the 2030s. Now, the Californians are struggling over something mighty to build high-speed rail between San Francisco and Los Angeles. I just hope one day that Leeds will have a tram. Do you think it will ever happen?
No, I don't. I'm afraid it's less likely the more in the local elections you have more and more parties, each of them playing to different constituencies. Also, of course, Sir Keir Starmer has said that he's going to build 1.5 million homes in one parliament, and essentially the planning and building regulations and so on are stopping him. And so what can one do? I mean, this is essentially, it's a political issue, isn't it? Because if you can get the politicians to impose their will on the lawyers, then things can start to move. But until you do, we are stuck, as you say, in a country which has got the house prices of California and the income levels of Mississippi.
Help us reason through this, because I suspect a lot of our listeners are also puzzled by this when it is manifestly unjust for young people to not be able to afford homes, when a lot of people are very tired of these endless construction sites, when Heathrow, $30 billion to build a runway. That's quite a lot of money. How can Britain be so stuck when there seems to be a need to confront these challenges?
Do you have the expression NIMBYism in the United States? Yes.
I believe we invented it, but...
Did you? Yes, got it. Well, unfortunately, like so many things in Britain, when you coughed, we caught a cold. And it's... so there's an element of NIMBYism, and there's also just the power of local authority committees to hold things up, and especially judicial review of absolutely everything, which holds things up. But as I say, it ultimately has to be an issue of political will. And if you do have a prime minister who's a lawyer and a lot of his cabinet are lawyers, and nobody in his cabinet at all has made so much as $1 from private entrepreneurship or private enterprise or ever run a company, you're going to have a logjam that therefore holds up the whole process. And yes, as you say, I mean, in California, at least what you're holding up is ultimately going to be an extraordinary thing if it happens. Whereas we can't even put some trams on the streets of Leeds. Tell me, one of the things that this has might lead to, which is something else that you've written about, is a series of European Trumps. And we have Nigel Farage, the leader of the populist party, Reform Party in England, but obviously the French and Germans and Hungarians and many others have political parties, populist parties, way to the right of him. Can you see a world in which we would have a series of European Trumps?
Well, if I sound a little bit gloomy about the U.S., I want to shift registers on Europe, which I feel is much more apocalyptic. So my sense of Europe is that, at least economically, it faces two pretty big threats. Now, I'm married to a European, I'm married to an Austrian, and we spend quite a bit of time in Europe every year. Last summer, we spent most of the summer in the city of Copenhagen. And Denmark has been one of the relative winners in the EU. But when we were there, one day I opened up the papers to see that the share price of Novo Nordisk, originator of Ozempic, fell by about 30% in one day, and mostly out of competition from US-based Eli Lilly. And that was one of these very stark realizations I had that, it is pretty obvious that China is deindustrializing Europe right now. We can see it in the German industrial data already that China is threatening a lot of traditional competences in industry across Europe. But what the Novo Nordisk news helped me better appreciate is that the Europeans are going to be outcompeted by the Americans on essentially everything else. That there's these gems in Europe like ASML in the Netherlands, which is making EUV lithography equipment. But with respect to pretty much everything else, I think that Americans are more competitive on biotech, more competitive on banking, finance, more competitive on software, AI. And so, I see Europe as fighting this two-front economic war against the Chinese on manufacturing, the Americans on everything else, and they're losing. And waiting in the wings are these right populist parties, National Rally in France, the AfD in Germany, which seem to be outpolling ruling incumbents today. And so if the electoral chaos is one electoral cycle away, I suspect that these populists will not deliver healthy economies. And so, and as the economies weaken, how are the political systems going to get better? What is a more optimistic case about Europe that I may be missing?
No, you're being optimistic yourself with the massive unemployment that AI and robotics are about to unleash. We've already got 16% youth unemployment in Britain, 16%, and I can't see that coming down if we carry on the way we're going. And so, of course, that is. I mean, historically, that kind of thing has always helped extremist parties. Both of the right and the left, but specifically, as you say, of the right in Europe's case. And so the closer we get, unless we're able somehow to work out a way that AI and robotics is going to bring down unemployment rather than increase it, there are very dark political days ahead, it strikes me. So I'm afraid I'm just as pessimistic or more than you.
What happens if Nigel Farage becomes PM?
Well, I mean, the party he leads is full of has-beens, cranks, a few rather disreputables. I'm afraid quite a few of them from my own party, the Conservative Party. And as you say, he doesn't have the economic answers. He's got it's a mélange really of nationalist knee-jerk responses and a bit of left-wing nationalisation. Still, he was talking about nationalising the steel industry, for example, and then he changes his mind a good deal. So what we're not going to see is some kind of an economic renaissance, such as we saw under Margaret Thatcher, which is what we desperately need. That's the way I see it, anyway. I obviously can't look into the future any more than anybody else. Let's talk about maths. As you call it, it's maths as we call it. 4 out of 10 American 8th graders score below basic in math. The Chinese seems to have dealt with this problem educationally in their schools. What's going to be the result of that in 10, 20, 30 years' time?
Well, it is a giant scandal how many American children have not been given great education, not only in mathematics, but also in reading generally. And this is where I think, I want to remain hopeful about the U.S. And this is part of the promise of the U.S. is that one usually has something hopeful to be hopeful about. We brought up Mississippi earlier for having a low income. That is definitely true, that Mississippi is one of the poorest states in the union. But there's been something quite astonishing to come out of Mississippi over the last few years in which they changed some aspects of their reading curriculum, in which reading scores have improved very, very substantially in the state of Mississippi. Mathematics is quite challenging. It seems like on average, the American school system is trying to reduce the emphasis on mathematics and reducing these requirements on calculus. Now, if you and I stroll through the Stanford library, I suspect what we will find is that a lot of pretty smart kids at Stanford are plugging everything they see into artificial intelligence, chatbot tools, and then taking a break by watching TikTok short videos. And so I'm not sure that we can find inspiration right here on campus. But I think that we could also be hopeful that maybe there is a way to integrate the AI tools, which are probably unstoppable for a lot of these students, to encourage some of the smartest folks to use them a little bit better. At the same time, we should hope that American students are much more interested in physical chemistry or physics or all sorts of engineering projects, such that it's not just the Chinese which are graduating all of the STEM PhDs. And as a simple reform, I propose that if we take a look at the number of STEM PhDs being graduated in China every year, it's about 10 times as many as US STEM PhDs. And if we take a look at the U.S. STEM PhDs, many of them are of Chinese heritage, Chinese origin, whom the Americans kind of kick out as soon as they finish their PhDs for them to go back to China. And so the STEM PhD gap is real, and it is perhaps even understated if we just take a look at the numbers alone. And so, something I propose quite simply is to stop kicking out all of these foreign PhDs and make them do science in America instead.
When you say make them, you mean encourage them, allow them?
Not create a hostile visa environment in which they feel like they have to have a job immediately, otherwise they have to exit the country.
Mm. Tell us about Chinese demography. Quite a lot of people, especially those who believe in the Thucydidean trap, look to, which essentially sort of argues that China, like every other country in the world that gets to the position globally that China's in, starts to dream about world domination. But But is that the case with China, firstly, which does have a very different world history than most other countries? And also, is it even possible, considering their demographics over the next 20, 30, 50 years?
Yeah, well, 50 years from now, the world will be very different. China's demographic picture is quite severe 50 years from now, in which possibly their median age is going to rise to something like 50 into the 50s. And it's impossible to imagine a society in which the median person is aged 50, but that seems to be the scenario a few decades from now in China. But if we look at the nearer term, something like the next 20 years, then China's demographic picture does not look all that severe up until 20 years from now. So it's going to take until the late 2040s when their demographic picture is going to really bite, because the curve of decline right now is not so severe. And what I'm mostly focused on is the next 20 years, the next 10 years, in which China might threaten to overrun a lot of Western manufacturing and use that to create a fairly decisive advantage for themselves before their demographic picture really bites. And so, something I'm afraid of is that just right on the cusp of the demography becoming a really serious problem for them, what if they fully deindustrialize Germany? I think that, what if that's the last thing they do? That would be a pretty severe problem for the West. And if we, buy into a lot of this AI hype, AI apocalyptic scenario, it is really difficult for a lot of the engineers in Silicon Valley to imagine the next 2 years, to say nothing of the next 20 years. When I'm trying to talk to them about, what might happen 20 years from now, some of them tell me that they're focused on just what might happen in the next 2 months from now. Now, I'm speaking to you as a historian, Andrew. 2 years and 2 months is not an especially long unit of time. But
no, there's 20 years actually in terms of history. It's the blink of an eye, isn't it?
It's the blink of an eye. Maybe we should think in century terms, but that is not the California way. And when I'm in California, I usually try to spend a lot of time with these engineers in their 20s, going to these house parties with them. And, the level of enthusiasm they have with AI is really just off the charts. I'm constantly surprised at a pretty high level. From when I'm already pretty baking in my expectations of how enthusiastic they are about AI, they're still surpassing my expectations. And so, this is part of these really puzzling things that we really have to grapple with. It's hard enough imagining the first order impact of what AI is going to do, and it's and we're also supposed to think about the 17th order impact of AI, and that is but still we have to start grappling with some of these big questions.
And one of the questions, at least in Britain at the moment, that's dominating this subject is the regulation of AI, the areas in which, for societal reasons, AI is going to places that we don't want to go to, and how do you stop it, essentially? What the latest example, obviously, being the way in which ChatGPT and various other companies are able to do things with regard to pornography that has sort of shocked quite a lot of Britons and has got parliamentarians interested in the question of regulation. Where do you stand on that? Do you think that that we can regulate it, that we should? What if we don't?
I think that there is a growing populist wave against AI. And what we can see, at least in the US, is that Bernie Sanders has been speaking quite extensively about AI. And I think it is probably not great news for the industry that the probably the furthest left senator in the U.S. Senate is very keenly interested in this topic. At the same time, we have someone like Steve Bannon, who has publicly proclaimed a holy war against AI and Silicon Valley writ large. And so, when you have Bannon and Bernie in agreement, it probably doesn't bode super well. This year has been an awfully miserable winter for the U.S. East Coast, and big snowstorms, really cold weather, and people are starting to complain about their electrical bills, fairly or unfairly, being driven up by data centers. Now, whether or not this can translate into regulation, whether or not this can translate into effective regulation, are different questions. But I suspect that from our wonderful bubble in Silicon Valley, where weather is usually pretty great, we are not quite appreciating how much the rest of the country is actually pretty keen to rein in a lot of the tech titans who have not, I would say, covered themselves in glory over the past year as they cozied up to, too many elements of the worst aspects of the Trump administration. And so I think that the regulatory element is a different question, but at least the politics don't appear to be very favorable towards the tech titans today, who speak in these very strange terms. If we listen to Dario Amodei of Anthropic, Sam Altman, I don't believe that they have been especially good spokespeople for the industry. They come across as either cold and bureaucratic, or they're speaking about the apocalypse. And these are, registers that do not speak very well, I think, to the rest of Americans and the rest of the world.
What was it like to have been in China during COVID? You were there throughout COVID, weren't you? What insights did you get into the Chinese government's thinking about such an extraordinary occasion as that?
I spent 3 years in China throughout the entirety of zero COVID. And one of these Chinese perspectives of COVID is that I think that, COVID is for most people is something that they prefer to block out. Which years exactly were COVID again? Now, for the Chinese, I think there's a very clear start date of COVID, and there's a very clear end date of COVID. The start date of COVID was January 23rd, 2020, in which the Beijing announced a lockdown in the city of Wuhan and the general province of Hubei. And the end of COVID came mid-December in 2022, when the central government announced a series of regulations to essentially dismantle zero COVID essentially overnight. And so across these 3 years, January 2020 to December 2022, what we saw was at the very start, the first act was this remarkable anger against the government, in which this was the second pandemic in 2 decades. The first was SARS, in which local officials seemed to have covered up a bad news of a bad political event. And the central government had to impose a pretty severe quarantine process in order to control the virus, in which we had these heroes like Dr. Leland, who was a medical whistleblower who tried to alert the public about this disease and was disciplined by the authorities from spreading rumors, essentially, was the allegation. And then there was a second act of COVID, in which as COVID started to spread from Wuhan and Hubei, it seemed like the rest of the world did not distinguish themselves in reacting very, very well to the spread of the virus, in which Chinese saw that first the Italians, then the Americans, then the rest of the world really did not control this virus effectively. And the zero COVID program in China seemed to look not so bad, in which my life in Beijing then, and then subsequently in Shanghai, did not feel like it was, there was too much to ask to put on masks or flash or contact tracing app in return for broadly normal life, in which we were able to go to cinemas, we were able to go into restaurants while the virus was not spreading. And then there was a third act of COVID, in which Shanghai lockdown, in which I would say that the Chinese government imposed what was probably the most ambitious quarantine in the history of humanity, in which China's largest city of about 25 million people was essentially unable to step foot outside of their apartment compounds over 10 weeks in the spring of 2022, in which a lot of people were shocked. China's richest city. People there were suffered food shortages in which parents were going hungry to save food for their kids because the logistical system entirely broke down. And then there was a denouement to this great act in which protests spread sporadically but intensively throughout the country, especially in Shanghai, in which people were chanting "Down with the CCP," "Down with Xi Jinping," but really extraordinary things. I had never expected that people would step outside the streets to chant something like this. And I went to some of these Shanghai protests in which young people were very, very mad about what was happening there. And so, this is something that, something that started awfully in which the Chinese state capacity really asserted itself. And then everything collapsed because the engineers cannot manage a society very effectively. And this is one of these central episodes in my book, along with the one-child policy, in which I point out how literal-minded the Chinese can be in terms of treating society as a math exercise, in which the number is right there in the name of zero COVID and one child. There's no ambiguity about what these things mean. And I was reminded by a quote from Winston Churchill, perhaps you've come across this one, that scientists should be on tap and not on top. And that still feels like a very wise statement to me.
Very wise indeed. Yes, he did say that. You're a great foodie, aren't you? You love your food. You've written about the food of Da Nang and what you call the croissant theory, and you've written about mango and passion fruit. Tell us, first of all, tell us what your croissant theory of history is, and what and why we should all go to Da Nang to eat.
Well, I am a great fan of croissants. Having married an Austrian who claimed to have sort of invented the croissant after they defeated the Turks. It took that crescent shape, almost as a sort of mockery. I seek out croissants everywhere. Now, the French obviously have excellent croissants, but I believe that the Danish have the best baked goods in the world, what they call is it viennoiserie, Vienna
Yes.
bread? But everything, all these cardamom buns, they're really excellent. Now, in terms of a general food profile, I prefer to eat in Spain or Italy if I could eat in European cuisine. But strangely to me, it is although the Spanish and the Italians have the best overall cuisines, they have not produced excellent baked goods. And so when the Europeans give the Americans a hard time for not having excellent croissants, which I acknowledge is mostly real, I also point out that the Spanish and the Italians haven't gotten there either. Da Nang in Vietnam, I think, is an underrated food city. I think that the rice products there are some of the best that I've had, and they have the excellent use of seafood. They have excellent use of beef, and I encourage anyone to go to Da Nang and try out some of the rice products, the beef as well as the seafood. It's right in between Hanoi and Saigon, and so it's a wonderful place to travel.
Mango and passion fruit, they're also passions of yours, aren't they? Tell us about
fruits.
your theory of how there needs to be round the clock mango.
Absolutely. I think this would not surprise anyone in South India, South Asia, that we need to have mangoes all the time. I am a great lover of tropical fruits. This is something I really crave in the winters in the U.S. And so passion fruit, mango, to say nothing of durian. I think that we all need to be eating a lot more of these tropical fruits in our lives. These lush, very sweet, perhaps too sweet, but these lush, vitamin-rich tropical fruits. These are my great loves.
What history book or biography are you reading at the moment, Dan?
I have a book that is next on my shelf. I'm presently I'm reading a new history book called, I believe it's just called Mexico by Paul Gillingham, which has just come out. I'm supposed to take a trip with my wife to Oaxaca, and so I'm reading a little bit about the Spanish conquest of the Americas right now. The next big history book on my list is by a historian, I believe, named N.A.M. Rogers, called The Price of Victory, which is a history of the Royal Navy. And that
it's excellent, by the way. In fact, I think I'm on the back cover plugging it. It's a really very fine book. And actually, for somebody like you who's very interested in engineering and finance and the way that the two are put together in order to create national security, that will give you so many lessons and messages and facts and figures and quotations. You'll be absolutely inundated with great data for the way in which that was done in the late 18th, early 19th century by Britain.
I think that's a very strong endorsement, and it's quite remarkable how the Navy has produced these excellent historians like Paul Kennedy, who wrote a book called Engineers of Victory about how so many of the British engineers helped to win the war. So I am always very curious now when I chatted with my rabbi at Hoover, Stephen Kotkin, about some great history books. I really want to help. I want to ask you, Andrew, given my interests, help me build a great books program in history. I'm going to put you on the spot. What are 5 excellent history that I really need to read?
Very fortunately, this is my podcast interviewing you rather than the other way around. But actually, funny enough, I think I did write a 5 great books once. I'm going to email you this one, Dan.
Very good.
Last question: what if the great counterfactual? What's your historical what if that interests you?
Let's see. I think that I read your book on the Second World War about when it came out, when I was still in college.
Thank you, appreciate that.
And something I'm curious about is if the Wehrmacht was able to reach Moscow and overrun Moscow, would the war have ended right then and there, because the Russian will to resist will have collapsed after the Wehrmacht seized Red Square, or might Stalin have moved deeper into the Urals and fought on, as indeed the Russians allowed for Moscow to be burned by Napoleon in the past? Could the war have ended there, or was Franz Halder right, or was the Wehrmacht, must they have keep fighting?
Stalin had his personal train made ready in Moscow on the 19th of October 1941. He could have got on it and left. If he had and gone back behind the Urals, fought on from Yekaterinburg or somewhere like that, then a kind of partisan stroke guerrilla war would have continued. But the Russians wouldn't have had any industrial capability with regard to building factories. They tried to move factories back beyond the Urals, but it was very basic. So yes, they'd have fought on, but they would have been a sort of tiny disorganized guerrilla movement that the Wehrmacht would have been able to have taken care of. It might have gone on for years and years, but it wouldn't have altered the geopolitics. So yes, the world would have been a much more horrible, dark and dangerous place with Hitler in complete control from the Urals to Brest, essentially. The war wouldn't have ended because he'd have then attacked Britain. Or he'd have gone down through Egypt and cut us off from our commerce and our oil, which large part of which came from Iraq. So it would have been a catastrophic moment for the West, as well as obviously for the Soviet Union. Gosh, what a good what if. I like that one very much. Can I give you one? What if China wasn't communist? What if Kuomintang had won the civil war in 1949? Do you think I'm not obviously arguing that it turns into a free market country in the 1950s necessarily, but is it less or more of a danger considering the Thucydidean trap than it is today?
It might well be that a China not ruled by the Communist Party is more of a danger to the West today. Because I think what we underlying a lot of how China thinks of itself, the broader Chinese society, beyond the Leninist aspect of the Communist Party, let's remember what the Kuomintang stands for. It is the Nationalist Party. Now, I expect that the Nationalist Party will continue to remain quite nationalist. Maybe if Chiang Kai-shek had prevailed with American intervention, as we see in the island nation of Taiwan today, that it could be a pretty pro-America place. But it might also be the case that the Chinese may be nursing their humiliations from the Opium Wars, the fascist invasion by Japan, that they are still, trying to return to some, aspect of their self-understanding that Asia, East Asia, and South Asia was much greater in the past, and that they need to do a lot better. That they understand themselves to have been the world leaders in science, technology, commerce, high-end manufactured goods, in which the West was able to offer very little in exchange for Chinese porcelain, Chinese silk, a lot of fine-made Chinese products. And it might be the case that the Communist Party has repressed the Chinese people for far too long. That if the Chinese nation was able to escape something like the Great Leap Forward, as well as all the landlord reforms, as well as the Cultural Revolution, that China would be much stronger today, that it could be much prouder today, and therefore, be much more emboldened to challenge the West today. And so, we have to think the what if hinges on our judgment of whether the Communist Party has repressed the people more, or has saved the people more. Now, if we focus on the Mao years, I think it is undeniable that the Communist Party has makes too much of the century of humiliation and should really focus a little bit more on the quarter century of self-humiliation, quite a lot more instead. But if we take a look at everything that Deng and his successors have built, which China is, after all, still overrunning the world on electric vehicles, building so much of the power capacity, inventing the technologies of the future, maintaining chokeholds on many critical technologies, then that still represents a pretty big threat. So that's a very unsatisfying answer, a very two-sided handed answer to your what if. I'm sorry.
It's a brilliant answer, and you're obviously right. Dan Wang, author of the brilliant Breakneck and distinguished Hoover Fellow, thank you very much indeed for coming on Secrets of Statecraft.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thank you, Dan. My next guest on Secrets of Statecraft is Lord Nigel Biggar, author of Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we generate and promote ideas advancing freedom. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.